Good afternoon. This is Sandy Vosk, President of Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals, New York, New Jersey Roundtable. And it's a pleasure to have everybody join us today. It's the first international roundtable webinar, I think, that's ever been conducted. And I'm thrilled to be collaborating with my colleague, Len Panett, and our joint roundtable organizations on both sides of the pond. It's truly front page news for quite some time, the global supply chain disruption. And we couldn't be more pleased to be providing this to you. Just a brief note about CSCMP. It is truly a very special organization, which stated mission is to advance the supply chain profession by connecting, educating, and developing the world's supply chain management professionals throughout their career. And this collaboration is very special today because out of the 80 registrants, Len and I are thrilled that we have 34 students on the call. So with that, I want to hand it over to Len, and please take it.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Sandy. It can't have escaped anybody's notice that the topic of supply chain and logistics in particular has been occupying center stage in every level of society for the last 2 years.
Recording in progress.
We'd already seen a large increase in disruption in supply chains, and some of that disruption was leading to effects that were being talked about in news interviews, on radios, of various social media, and of course in the various business literature. In the last 18 months, that has ramped up. We've seen the impacts of the pandemic worldwide, and further disruptions from ships interrupting the Suez Canal, for example, to fires in key ports in China, all of that disrupting the flow of goods and provision of services worldwide. In the US and the UK, those issues have been felt very acutely, albeit for very different reasons. And we felt that the time was right for there to be an exchange in views of where we've come from, what the experience of both countries, and how we've got to the situation we're in today, and what's being done about it. The idea of today's session and the follow-on session next month as well is to help develop the knowledge and understanding of the situation with truck drivers, HGV drivers, and warehousing, and further afield in the logistics chains. So joining us today, we have a...
And before you do that, can I just ask, I forgot one thing, and it's really important, but it's perfect on a segue from what you just shared. Before we introduce the panelists, we wanted to know what was important to you folks out there. So we have a polling question, and while Len is introducing the panelists, if you take a moment or two and just consider it, we would love your feedback on what you feel is the number one issue impacting your company, or as a student, what you see is the number one issue affecting the supply chain today. Your feedback is really, really important for us. All right, Ed, Len, sorry about that.
That's all right. Thanks, Andy. So joining us today, we have a fantastic panel from both sides of the Atlantic, representing professional organizations and industry, not just in the UK and US, but also further afield. So in no particular order, Coca-Cola is one of the most well-known brands in the history of mankind, I think it could be argued. And joining us today is Rob Haddock, who's the Group Director of Planning and Logistics. And Rob is also a board member of CSCMP. In the UK, we've got the UK Warehousing Association, and that's Britain's leading trade organisation for the logistics sector, with over 800 members, providing a voice for logistics in the UK. And joining us from the UK Warehousing Association, we have Claire Bottle, who took over the role as CEO in June earlier this year. Back across the Atlantic, the Trucking Association of New York is the voice of trucking in the state of New York. And with us today is the president of TANI, Kendra Hems. Our opposite number in the UK, the Road Haulage Association, is the UK's leading trade association dedicated to road transport operators. And joining us from the UK RHA is Sally Gilson, who very kindly stepped into the breach when the CEO of the RHA, Richard Burnett, was called away for a high-level briefing with the UK government. And finally, we have the pleasure of having with us today Professor Doctor or Dr. Professor Dale Rogers, the ON Semiconductor Professor of Business at Arizona State University. Earlier this year, he received CSEMP's 2021 Distinguished Service Award and is also an inductee of CSEMP's Hall of Fame. Welcome, everybody. Back to you, Sandy.
Thanks. So I'll end the poll and share the results. Can people see that?
Yes.
So it looks pretty close to, access to inventory, labor shortages, and supply chain volatility. And I don't think that's surprising that those three would be as close. So with that, I would like to let me start the first question, if I may, Len, and I'll address it to Rob Haddock first. And given what we're seeing and hearing every day about global supply chain problems, from your perspective and Coca-Cola, how did we get here?
Well, Sandy, thanks for the question. And it's ironic that on the prior poll, changes in consumer demand did not even get any votes. But if you can look at customer demand through our services and a big shift towards goods, which has created a lot of different supply chain challenges for our organization. My internet just froze.
Kendra, how would you answer that?
Yeah, I actually agree with Rob. I was a little surprised to see that the change in customer demands had, no votes for it, because we've seen, I think, over the last 2 years, about a 57%, almost 60% increase in e-commerce deliveries, largely stemming, obviously, from the pandemic. But I think in terms of the supply chain itself, it's not just one piece of the puzzle. There's so many pieces that have to interconnect. It's incredibly complex. And I think we were starting to see some challenges even before the pandemic hit. And then the pandemic just accelerated everything between the stimulus buying, the panic buying. There was just such a shift in demand, and we weren't prepared for that. So the short answer is the pandemic, of course, created this issue. But in reality, I think we were seeing challenges even before the pandemic hit that just were exacerbated as a result.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. Claire, one of the things that, Len and I, when we started talking about this, he shared with me that, we're having all the same problems you are, and then there's Brexit. So, how do you see, the situation? Come off, great, thanks.
Well, I would definitely agree with what Kendra said, and it's interesting that we're seeing a rise in e-commerce on both sides of the Atlantic. So we've been measuring how much space is dedicated to warehousing in the UK, and when we compare the figure from 2015 with 2021, it's an increase of a third. So we have a third as much again warehousing in a space of just 6 years. And whilst we've seen growth in warehousing in every single sector, whether it's high street retail or automotive manufacturing, the biggest growth is definitely warehousing associated with e-commerce. So some of those factors are the same. But to answer your question, Sandy, we have also got this Brexit situation. And because of companies' fears about import and export, I think what that's tended to do is to encourage people to hold more inventory than normal. So I think some of the growth we've seen in warehousing is not just the e-commerce, which is the most dramatic part, but more generally, everybody's holding more stock because they're just not confident about being able to import and export with the same speed that we would have done when we were part of the EU.
Thanks so much for that. Dale, I think you have a unique perspective from the academic world and, really historically. So how do you see this, and what would you share, especially to the students on the call?
Well, this is one of those things. I'll try to keep my answers short, Sandy, because I'm an old professor and it's hard to keep my answers short, honestly, because it's such an interesting question. And as everybody has said, there's so many different things going on. we've really been having more supply chain disruptions the last 10 years than we've ever had in all the previous years, going back a century, really. And of course, the pandemic is the biggest disruption of all time. So we're already seeing supply chain change quickly. I've been teaching for more than 30 years the square root law, which says the amount of inventory to keep the same level of service increases at the square root of the number of facilities in a network. So if you go from 1 facility to 4 facilities, square root of 4 is 2. You double the amount of inventory you need when you move from 1 to 4 facilities. And as Claire said, we're actually seeing some forward buying, and we're seeing this Amazon-driven model where we have more facilities in a warehousing network, as opposed to the last 25 years where we were consolidating facilities. So we're just seeing more inventory in the system, in many systems, just in general. This huge move to e-commerce, really globally, which drives up inventories. The supply chains were very tightly developed, so this would be a lot of trauma anyway. And we've also seen a fair amount of bad politics, haven't we? I'm an American, so I can't say I fully understand Brexit, but that's going to create supply chain problems for a long time. This idea of becoming nationalistic, and we're seeing this really around the world. I mean, it's not just a flu that the US seemed to have caught crazily during the Trump administration. It's really a flu that's kind of going around the world. It's quite surprising to me that after 150 years of really pretty clear theoretical thought around free trade. I mean, we got about 150 years of knowing that free trade actually works pretty well. That we've seen several countries, the UK, Korea and Japan have had a trade war the last couple of years. And in the US, we decided to turn away from a lot of the world right when we were so totally connected. It's interesting. The Trump trade policies have really worked out negatively for American companies, and a fair amount of the cause of these crazy bubbles that are moving through supply chains are the result of China, sort of pivoting away from the US, and the US actually putting tariffs on Chinese product. And then since the tariffs have been on, we've increased our buying from China 31%. I mean, it's like a third, and there's just a bunch of dumb things at the same time. And my son, the younger Dr. Rogers, who teaches supply chain at Colorado State, I like his analogy. He says, "Dad, it's like Scottsdale Road where there's 10 red lights." I was driving down Scottsdale Road yesterday, and I think there is 10 red lights. And you can get through the first one by fixing stuff at the port, but then there's 9 more. And some of them are political. Some of them are issues with unions at the port. Most American unions are less powerful than they used to be. The seeing costs in China increase. And labor issues, this move to e-commerce. At any rate, I'll stop talking, because this is one of those things you could talk about for a few hours, of how many things at one time have happened that are helping to create the problem. And the lot of supply chain managers, like some of the esteemed folks on this call, it's never been harder, because there's so many variables that you have to manage at the same time the whole system is changing.
Thank you so much on that, Dale. Before I let Len give question two, I would just say that the rocket fuel and all that is the labor shortage. And, never before have we experienced anything like that. Obviously, that's the theme of our next webinar on November 3rd. But Len, go ahead.
Actually, before I get to the second one, I was picking up a lot of those points that we're saying there. And I think, Sandy, you've hit the nail on the head. This point about the labor shortage, this isn't new. As I said at the beginning of the introduction, we've been seeing underlying supply chain concerns, if not outright worries, for a number of years. We'd seen the problem with truck drivers ramping up very, very continuously for at least 10, 15, 20 years. I'm sure Dale will correct me and extend that. And we'd seen an issue of labor throughout warehousing and logistics up and down the value chain, also ticking up. I'm wondering if what the panel thinks to the idea that what we've seen in the last 2 years is we've gone from a situation of just about coping, which supply chains are very good at doing, to actually we can't cope anymore. And part of the problem is, as Dale rightly points out, we have a perfect storm of COVID hitting that manpower situation even more, as well as demand volatility spiking up, and everything cascades down from those two issues. I'll start with Claire. Claire, what do you reckon?
Well, I think the pandemic has definitely caused us some problems. And what I'm hearing quite a lot of from our members at the UK Warehousing Association is, and I appreciate, Len, that this is really, partly a topic for the next session that we're going to be doing in November, but we have a kind of a triple whammy, if I can put it, of 3 different types of labour problems. So one of them is that trained warehouse labour, so people who've got forklift truck licenses. A big proportion of those people were EU nationals, some of whom no longer have eligibility to work in the UK workforce. And for various reasons, a lot of those people have returned to their home economies. The second one is that because of the rise of e-commerce, we need a lot more labour, and that's at a more sort of low skilled level. So pick and pack type operations, you don't need a forklift license for that, but it is quite labour intensive, and activities that would have taken place in the high street are being pushed back up the supply chain into the warehouse and demanding more labour. And I think the third problem is a bit more difficult to describe, but it's just simply that people are exhausted. So those who are in leadership and management positions expect to be busy at this time of year because there's always a peak. Admittedly, we don't celebrate Thanksgiving here in the UK, but nevertheless we experience Black Friday, and then we have a big run up to Christmas, and for lots of businesses there's a peak in demand which drives a lot of activity in the supply chain. The difference this time round is that since Christmas 2019, people haven't stopped. So there have been so many shocks coming upon other shocks. Trying to manage all of that with insufficient labour is just untenable. And we're seeing people leaving the industry who loved it, but just can't cope anymore.
Yes. And we've started to see retailers and other companies setting up their own academies to develop people to be able to do that. Rob, I hope you're back with us. How is Coca-Cola adapting to the situation?
You need to come off mute, Rob.
Sorry for the technical difficulties, Len. I'm at an Uber Freight conference, and I am trying to find a quiet place at the new office that they just launched. And if you're familiar with the old Chicago post office, they've just occupied this space. So it's not quite ready yet. There's no quiet room, so I'm trying to avoid a couple hundred people to get on this call. With Coca-Cola, and I'll just build on what some of the other folks have said, is that I think Coca-Cola and a lot of the other CPG companies, we're on the razor's edge from a supply chain perspective in regards to supply and demand. And short-term weather events, holiday events, even promotional events sometimes can stress the supply chain. We're in our 19th month of imbalance between consumer demand, where more consumption at home is occurring versus consumption away. And it's not just the Coca-Cola network. My peers that are here Also in the CPG space, we're all struggling with the same thing, that we may have manufacturing capacity, but a 6-pack of napkins on the shelf at a grocery retailer is dramatically different than a pallet of napkins that you would send to a food service distributor. And all of the infrastructure upstream to manufacture those materials and the staffing that's required to make the product and to move it through the warehouses. We're coping, but we really could use a return to more services spending versus goods spending. And I think that would go a long way to balance a lot of the supply chain.
Excellent. And actually, you've just hit the rather nicely segued into the next question, which is, what are the immediate actions that we need to be taking now and over the next few weeks, if not months? I think, Kendra, picking up Claire's point, I know that the trucking situation in New York has just been running at 125% for the last 2 years. And you're about to run into, as Claire also rightly points out, into Thanksgiving and the end of the year, which is always the busiest time. So what sort of things are you seeing being done to cope with that?
Well, it is a struggle. And again, not to take away from the next session, but I was looking at numbers, and I think the July numbers from DOL showed about almost 500,000 employees short between warehousing and transportation. We're looking at about 60,000 just for truck drivers across the country. And the challenge is there is no short-term solution. There is no quick fix. I know we all want this silver bullet to fix this problem, but everything that can address this issue is going to take time, years, unfortunately, time. So the trucking industry has been dealing with a driver shortage for many, many years, even prior to the pandemic hitting. And like every industry, we had individuals leave that just aren't coming back. And then trying to encourage individuals into the trucking industry is challenging. It's not an incredibly sexy career. So it's difficult at best to get individuals to even look at the industry as a solution. That said, I know both at our state level and the national level, we're having conversations with our policymakers about, are there any short-term fixes we can do to at least speed up the licensing process, cut through some of the red tape, try and find ways to work together to recruit individuals into the industry, maybe some populations or demographics that we hadn't previously looked at. We're actually working closely here in New York with our Department of Corrections and looking at an alternative to incarceration program as a new area where we're seeking to recruit individuals. And a lot of those programs are happening across the country. But again, it's not going to be a quick fix. I think from a supply chain perspective, there's so much coordination that needs to happen. It's not just trucking, it's not just the ports, not just rail. It's all of these groups coming together and trying to figure out where are the areas that we can improve our efficiencies. Are there maybe locations that are being underutilized when it comes to the container situation and the shipping situation that we can divert some of the traffic from the busier ports? And until we can get those conversations happening in earnest, I don't know that we're going to see, a quick fix solution to the problem at hand.
Yes, yeah, and Sally, some of the things that Kendra mentioned there, I think we've seen that in the UK as well. Things like changing the policy on hours that drivers can be on the road, changing the approach to testing. Are you seeing other developments?
Yeah, I think it's one of the fascinating points of the past year and a half is that the pandemic really caused a shift in the way we feel about work. And I think what happened is last year we saw a lot of people move away from working in logistics. As we all know, it's a 24/7 sector, and especially with driving, it's long hours, and people found that there were lots of jobs available in other roles where they could earn just as much money for less hours. So yeah, I think this reevaluation had a really big effect. And as Claire mentioned earlier, we've also had Brexit, and what we did see is that as a lot of people felt they wanted to go home during the pandemic. So actually a lot of Europeans, whether they'd applied for settled status here or not, decided to shift back home, and actually they can get a good salary back home and decided obviously to stay. So our labour shortages were here before COVID, before the pandemic, but I think what it did was it's completely exacerbated the problem. During the pandemic, our testing of HGV drivers effectively shut down. And it didn't just shut down in 2020, it also shut down in 2021. So we've seen a massive backlog in the number of people that are wanting to take their tests. So we're trying at the moment to get that process sped up. Picking up on something Kendra just said, our government has actually looked to introduce and simplify the testing process. It hasn't happened yet. It's got to kind of go through our parliament. So we're hoping that will come in about November, and that will hopefully speed things up a little bit, because it means that they won't have to do quite so many tests just to be able to get in the really big trucks. But yeah, you summed it earlier with this perfect storm, and I think that the one positive that I will take from this is the fact that because it's getting so much media attention, what we've seen is a massive uplift in the numbers of people that want to take their HGV test and now want to become a lorry driver. Salaries have increased as a result. That's the marketplace for you. And I think we just now need to retain their interest and keep them within the sector. It's something that we don't do very well. I don't think we've historically treated our drivers the best. So that's something that's got to be looked at. But in the short term, I think just breaking down those bureaucratic issues. Over here, we've got something called driver CPC, where our drivers have to do 5 days of training. And it's not very popular because it's all classroom training. That's something that could be looked at as a temporary measure just to suspend and then reform. But yeah, I mean, it's difficult to try and get people now ready for the Christmas rush. Most of the things that you can implement at this point are sort of medium to longer term.
Dale, picking up on both Sally and Kendra's points there, this pressure has the inevitable consequence of increasing the salaries, the wages for drivers and warehousing staff, and naturally that's going to proceed through the economics of businesses, and we'll start seeing inflationary pressures, which have their own consequences as well. Is there something that can be done to mitigate that? Are we just going to have to live with the fact that supply chains are going to be more expensive to operate for the next few years?
I actually think there's a resetting a little bit. So it's such a different time than when I was a kid. I grew up in Lansing, Michigan. So in Lansing, Michigan, they made a car. I always have to tell my students these days, an Oldsmobile was a car, because they mostly had never heard of Oldsmobile. But that Oldsmobile's town was Lansing, and the wages, most all of the parents of my friends worked at either Oldsmobile or Fisher Body, where they made the bodies, and the wages were good. You could have a middle class existence. And now many of the workers in warehouses, certainly in the US, and in the real heart of logistics, are working multiple jobs. I know some people that are working 3 jobs just to make it. And so I think there is a natural a sort of resetting. Labor. I lived in the UK in 1978 near Cambridge, and everybody complained about the difficult British labor, and Mrs. Thatcher was around the corner. But while those times weren't terribly efficient, probably in the UK, people were at least making a reasonable living, and we're gonna have to figure out some of that. The other thing is that I think companies are going to need a portfolio solution. So, you can't have three suppliers, and not just supplier diversity, but also geographic diversity. So you can't have three suppliers that are different companies, but they're all in Wuhan, China. That's not really a good plan. And so you're going to need a portfolio. And it is interesting. The UK is going to Brexit right when having a European solution, particularly with some of the lower level countries like Poland and so on, would make a ton of sense. You know, if you think about the UK historically going back 500 years, the United Kingdom has always been so good at managing stuff around the world with a relatively thin group of managers. I mean, it just was a brilliant system that's worth studying by everyone. And now, right when you need some new solutions, the UK is doing the opposite of what makes sense, at least to me sitting over here in Tempe, Arizona. So I put something in the chat, actually. I don't know if anybody would want to read it, but it's a piece from Harvard Business Review that we published in June about a Pan-American solution as being maybe a part. Now, it's a long-term answer, but clearly we're seeing China pivot away from the West. And maybe, at least in the US, maybe we can help fix immigration and some other issues by having a Pan-American solution. In the United Kingdom, I wouldn't be surprised if there was some use of Africa, but moving out of the EU seems like it really positions the United Kingdom poorly for a really good, at least part of a supply chain solution. So, you know, Mr. Johnson with the wacky hair over there, and I shouldn't be critical of anybody's hair, I suppose, but you know, Mr. Johnson was able to get Brexit through, but from an efficient and effective supply chain standpoint, it seems like the opposite of what should have happened.
Absolutely, Dan. And I think that your confusion over the situation is also shared by many people in the UK, I assure you. You mentioned the need to change the approach to the suppliers. Rob, one of the other things that we've seen in the UK, and I know several other companies have started as well, is a change in customer behavior. We've seen B2B buyers changing the approach to just in time, for example, to cope with the uncertainty. And that's obviously putting pressure on Claire's organization's members, increasing the amount of warehousing space that's called for. We've seen some companies simplifying the SKU range that they've got. Is this an opportunity? And this is a question from Maria on in the audience. Is this an opportunity for supply chains to start changing the behavior of customers?
Yeah, Len, it's a great question. I saw it in the chat. And, you know, is the customer the end user? Is the customer the outlet where the consumer gets the product? You know, we're going to those outlets where the customers pick up the products. They are operating extremely lean. A lot of them are dealing with the same shortages that we're having with getting product made and out for delivery. And we're trying to collaborate with them to make sure that, you know, the driving resources that are essential to, you know, kind of connect to the shipper and receiver, keep moving. We've invested a lot of time and energy in what you would consider shipper of choice and working with our carrier partners on drop and hit programs, and with our grocery retailers and our food service distributors to say, listen, every minute that driver is sitting there waiting to get offloaded is a mile or two we're taking away from the efficiency of the ecosystem. So we have technology that manages dwell. We have the ability to look at, you know, the transit times and the speeds that trucks are moving around the country. We've got to take it seriously and keep those drivers moving, because nobody's rushing to become a truck driver. And even though we're throwing even more money, this morning I saw signing bonuses of $10,000 come across one of the news channels. That still may not be enough to move somebody's you know, influence to to get behind the wheel of a truck, especially the over-the-road drivers. So it is both a shipper and receiver opportunity to collaborate together and start to look at all the pockets of efficiency and get them out of the way.
Thanks, Rob. One area, I'm glad you mentioned technology. As e-commerce is booming, so is technology, and technology is driving supply chain in countless ways. But I don't know if technology can save us or save us quick enough. So how can we best leverage people and technology in the processes today to address the issues? Let's start with Dale first.
Sorry, I had to unmute here. I think there's a lot of hope for technology. Now, one of the main reasons to adopt a lot of technology is to reduce your relying on people. We're seeing artificial intelligence be. I think, Sandy, you were in the session with Dr. Manny Janakiram from Intel and me, and we're really seeing a lot of uses of artificial intelligence here in the Phoenix area. Google has those Waymo cars driving all over the place, and about a month ago I was really startled because they're autonomous vehicles, but I'm pulled up at a stoplight and there was nobody in the driver's seat. I usually there's someone in the driver's seat. I kind of let, when the light turned green, I kind of let the car go ahead, and I kind of laid back because I know this is coming. I'm just not totally comfortable yet. But we're gonna see more of those things. In fact, if you think about one of my favorite Marvel superhero movies was Logan, which was kind of the end of Wolverine's life, and you saw the automated trucks driving all over, actually trying to run Wolverine down, which is not what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to deliver freight, but we're going to see a fair amount of that. We're going to see more and more artificial intelligence be built into systems. It's really happening very quickly, and it's a very exciting time in terms of technology development. It's the greatest time of change in my whole career, is like right now when it comes to technology. So technology will be part of the answer, but it can't be the whole answer. Some of this will be relieved as we work through the shocks in the system to the pandemic. If the pandemic ever really goes away, who knows? But you're going to have to manage a bunch of pieces that you didn't really have to manage before. There's going to be on supply chain managers, there's going to be technology that helps them automate some of the decisions, some of those planning decisions and so on. But the sort of strategic and tactical decisions about your supply chain and how you move stuff through and where do you get and so on, those are going to be more complex. So actually the job of supply chain managers is likely to expand a lot more at the same time that technology helps do some of the routine things maybe better and more efficiently.
Claire, I spend a lot of time in warehousing. That's a core focus to me. And technology, from autonomous robots to slotting technologies and automation. What do you see in terms of the UK in terms of that question? How can we best leverage people and technology to address the issues?
It's a great question, and I think I'd like to draw upon something we've been talking about at the conference that I'm at today here in Birmingham, where we've been talking about the twin ideas of going green and going digital. And one of the conclusions that all of our panelists agreed with, and believe me, there was a lot of dissent on certain points, but on this point it was unanimous, is that of the two, going green is probably the most important, but going digital is how you get there. And there was a lot of talk, back to your question, the part of your question about people, there's a lot of talk about increasing availability of data. Doesn't necessarily mean you've got decision making. Data can be a tool to help with decision making, but you still need people to make decisions. And even with AI, we're not at a stage yet where AI can make our decisions for us, certainly not in logistics or in warehousing. So I think, the automation of processes which are really boring or potentially dangerous is a great use of robots, and we're seeing much more flexible robotics in warehousing nowadays. 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, you had to know what the warehouse was going to be needing to do in 15 years' time in order to justify the capital investment that was required. Now, the types of robots you can deploy are so flexible that it doesn't matter whether you're going to need them later, because you can redeploy them for something else. It's not the same as hardwired and fixed infrastructure inside your warehouse building. But even more interesting than that, I think, is the ways in which we can use data, whether it's to create a kind of an import-export solution which doesn't rely on pieces of paper anymore, or whether it's to unlock a lot of information about the productivity of people picking and packing in a warehouse workforce. All of that data is only going to be useful if we have people who know how to use it.
Excellent point. Kendra, my dad was a truck driver, and I was always very sensitive to trucking as an industry. And I was shocked, actually, at how truck drivers, especially in the US, responded to cameras. And so, there was this assumption that they would not respond to technology. And I believe they are responding to technology. And perhaps there's more technology that can assist. So what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think what we typically see is there's always this hesitancy on the front end anytime new technology come out, whether it's cameras, as you suggested, or when we were transitioning to the electronic logging devices, there was a lot of pushback. But typically, once it gets implemented into the company, the drivers are trained on it, they start to recognize the benefits of it, there is an acceptance. And we've seen that by and large with both cameras, with the electronic logging devices, with various safety technologies that have been put on the trucks. Like, they do, I think, recognize that it helps them in their profession. So it's always a learning curve, but as we continue to introduce technology, typically we do see that acceptance. Where it's been interesting when we have these conversations about automation, for example, is some of the pushback that you get from the unions, where they talk about concerns with driver displacement. They tend to really be opposed to any idea that we would get to a point where there aren't drivers in trucks. But as we're seeing today, we don't have enough drivers. So I'm not really concerned about driver displacement. I think as we continue this path to integrate automation into the industry, it's going to follow with what the driving population is doing. The retirements are continuing. We're not getting as many new drivers into the system. So I don't think we're putting people out of a job. I think that we are looking at finding new efficiencies to address the fact that we have this shortage and that we're going to continue to need trucks in some manner in the future, and how do we do that and how do we do it efficiently? I agree with Claire that the technology and the environmental initiatives go hand in hand. We're seeing a lot of work, particularly in the urban areas, and some of this I think can tie into some of the port operations where automation makes sense. Taking that driver component out for that last mile, that short delivery, and then continuing to focus on the workforce development for the longer haul. So there's a lot of opportunity going forward with the use of technology in this industry. Just unfortunately, as we've talked about from the beginning of this panel, it's not a short-term fix. It's something that we see happening down the road.
Is Rob still there? Rob, how's Coca-Cola handling this from a technology perspective? I'd really be interested. I had, as you know, a background at Pepsi, so I'd love to know exactly what Coke's doing in that regard today.
Well, Sandy, myself and a partner are here in Chicago, and the last couple of days has been meetings with Uber Freight, Fortkites, which is the visibility partner, and also Transplace, who's a big technology company for managed freight. And technology has a place, and it is probably the number one thing that will get us out of the situation we're in today. On the flip side, I struggle finding the right people in the logistics space right now because they're in such high demand. So we have to rely on these technology partners. The challenge is trying to figure out how they all meld together and what will your technology stack look like. Everything from the load tendering to the load tracking to the dwell time management, so you can continue to drive efficiency through all of the physical spots on the supply chain.
Thanks so much. Before we move, Sally, if you're there, did you have a point of view?
Yeah, kind of agree, obviously, with Claire and the others. I think from our perspective, certainly from the road haulage, I think technology is mainly going to sort of help the green sort of sustainability side and safety, rather than sort of replace people. I think we're a very long way off driverless trucks within the UK. So certainly the next 10, 15, maybe even 20 years, we are going to need people driving those trucks. And it's probably something more for the second section. But in terms of sort of how to improve things, I think it is more of a people and a training perspective, and investing in people and just trying to drive the message to younger people of what kind of a career you can have within logistics. I think just getting those young people and fresh ideas coming into the sector will start to push things along anyway.
Thanks so much. Len, I know we had a couple of questions from the audience. You have one you want to share?
Yeah, we did. I suppose picking up some of the points that were made earlier on about the resilience in the supplier base. The question from John is, what type of carrier adjustments, local domestic, air versus ocean, for international parcel versus LTL, are you seeing based on limitations to capacity? Is flexibility or seeking new options important, or is this secondary to solidifying current carrier relationships? Dale, would you like to start with that one?
Yeah, actually, I think it's a great question. Honestly, I think the answer is kind of both. We're seeing folks go deeper in their relationship with carriers and really helping carriers to kind of work through some issues. And then we're also seeing sort of a looking around, maybe we should be doing this differently. A huge shock here in the US are those container costs on the spot market increasing. So let's say you're a Chinese company that makes Christmas lights, those little cheap green strings and so on. The value inside a container is about 40 grand of those. All of a sudden, the spot market rate, which you may not have contracts in place because you're a seasonal seller, all of a sudden the contract rates are over $20,000 a container, when a year ago they were like $1,300 or $1,900 or something. And so there's huge shocks in terms of costs, and the folks making the Christmas lights are going to look for either some other way to get them to a market, or they're going to look for a new market. So we're seeing a lot of scrambling around when it comes to carriers, both trying to deepen the relationship and say, look, things are going to be better, but also thinking, man, we got to rethink how we're doing this. I've never seen so much kind of moving around and changing the way you're moving product as I have really the last few months here. It's really quite amazing. One quick story, so interesting to me. I always take this group of Brazilian executives over to the Port of Oakland every summer. Not the last 2 summers, but most every summer. And in 2019, we're over at the Port of Oakland, and the Port of Oakland had just fallen from the 4th busiest port in the U.S. to the 5th. It went LA, Long Beach, New York, New Jersey, Oakland. And all of a sudden, Savannah passed Oakland. Well, then this spring, Oakland had fallen to the 9th busiest port. Isn't that interesting? How come? Why should we even care about that? Well, Oakland is, to a great extent, an export port. And so ships would call on LA Long Beach from Shanghai or Hong Kong or something, and then go up the West Coast and drop some stuff off in Oakland, but then pick up loads and go back home. Well, now most ships are just turning around LA Long Beach. The wait times are too long. And also there's no product to take back. China took the trade war seriously, while we didn't really in the US. And so there's huge amounts of changes, chassis imbalances and container imbalances and jam ups on the railroad in an intermodal sense. And there's all these things, and you got a whole lot of smart people who are working really hard to just keep the trains running, truthfully, keep things going. And I've never seen a time which was more difficult than right now in figuring out, because of all these incredibly fast changes, where you got to figure out stuff on the fly.
Yes, yeah, and I think some of those changes are coming through in the technology. Sally, we've seen, if I was to ask Claire about power and fuel in warehouses, we've seen a big change towards electric vehicles. Certainly, forklifts are now all electric, as they've been for a long time. How is that change from fossil fuel to EV likely to affect what we see on the roads as well, particularly last mile, actually?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, last mile is the easiest one to answer at the moment, because with last mile, you can use electric vans. I think once you start to get up to bigger vehicles, it becomes a much more confused message. At the moment, we can't see those EV HGVs coming through, and we're at that point where the government obviously has sort of set a cut-off date of 2035, but we don't really know which vehicles we should be investing in. And because we're sort of looking at a lifespan of about 10 years for an HGV, we need to know whether it's EV or whether it's going to be hydrogen. It seems like it's EV for the smaller vehicles and hydrogen for the larger vehicles, but that hydrogen has a question mark over it as well, because we don't know which hydrogen. So what we're really looking for is that guidance now, because these are not cheap vehicles. So when a business invests, it needs to know that it's investing in something that it's going to be able to keep for a long period of time. So I would say it's quite a confused message at the moment, much simpler for vans, because certainly the way that everybody is being pushed is in EVs, and there's massive take up now that the mileage is expanding. You can actually sort of do quite long journeys now without having to top up, but the infrastructure has to be put in place if we want to up the mileage and push that out from just those last mile deliveries. Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think that if I was to ask the same question of Kendra, which I'm going to do, we'll get a different answer. Kendra?
Actually, you're going to get a very similar answer. Obviously, at both the state and the national level, there is a move towards shifting from fossil fuel to electric or zero emission of some sort, electric obviously being the front runner. But we have the same challenges that Sally's experiencing. We don't have an infrastructure at the ready to support the deployment of those vehicles for the long haul. The grid that we have right now is already tapped. So in terms of being able to actually generate the power in order to charge all these new vehicles coming on the market is an incredible concern for us, as well as the cost to do so. The movement, of course, it sounds like we're on a similar timeline as Sally is. 2035 is one of our first deadlines in terms of new vehicle sales, zero emission vehicle sales hitting the market. And I'm just not sure that we're going to be ready to get there. So it is a concern.
Yes, excellent. Thank you. And welcome to CSEMP, little chap. So another question we've had from Jackie. What are the best practices to adjust internal product development mentality about supply constraints? We seem to hear, seems that they hear the constraints, but still expect rapid results. Any suggestions on how to better portray the realities? Rob, that sounds like a perfect one for you to start us with.
Lynn, on the product development side, I would have to imagine, most of our stuff is made domestically, whatever country we're in, with the exception of perhaps some unique ingredients that have to come from offshore, which at times can require, air freight if it gets too desperate. So it's those type of development opportunities that the more you can make within your own control, the better off you are. Or you have alternate suppliers that are not, geographically all centralized, where if one channel falls apart, you've got another resource that you can tap into. Excellent.
Thanks, Robin. Yeah, I think that I've heard very, very similar as well from others in the sector as well. So that's great. We're coming to the last 5 minutes. I think Anne Strauss-Weider has a fantastic question for us to take as the last one. I'm afraid we couldn't get to everyone's questions. Thank you very much for putting them in. So Anne's question is.
Before we do that, I just want to I'm just going to put up the last polling question, but then just hand it to Anne.
Excellent. So Anne's question, and I think this one's for the whole panel. What current supply chain issue or trend most keeps you up at night when you think about the future? Claire, we'll start with you.
Well, I think I'm going to answer this question by giving a big plug for the event coming up on the 3rd of November, because the thing which most keeps me awake at night is a combined issue about labour shortages and skills gaps. And I think at the moment, the short-term solution that we're applying to that is just money, which is not a sustainable one. We're spending more and we're wasting money. And I think the longer-term solution is something about improving the image of our sector to make it a more attractive place for people to work, and backing that up with better quality training to deal with the skills gaps.
Excellent.
If I could say something on that one comment, and just to me, one of the most important trends, it actually came up in one of the questions, but sustainability and diversity, equity, inclusion, all of that is so key. Claire, do you want to make I don't know what it's like in the UK on that, but do you want to comment on that?
Well, from the warehousing perspective, I would say that when logistics companies talk about sustainability, they fall into the trap of talking about transport sustainability. And I don't want to undermine any of that, because transport has a lot of carbon emissions and it is a good place to look. You get more bang for your buck when you invest in greening your transport fleet. But I also think that there's a risk that you overlook the important role of warehousing. So there are some tactical things like improving your lighting, electrifying the fleet, the MHE fleet, as Len explained. But then I think there's also a bigger question about the role that warehouses should play in a green circular economy, where we already see with the rise of e-commerce, lots of returns of products coming back to warehouses. Perhaps in a circular economy, we do more upcycling and more repair in the warehouse location too.
Excellent. Sally, your thoughts?
I'm just going to completely echo what Claire said earlier, and another promotion for the next part of this, and it is labour shortages. I think as a whole, we've got to do more to promote the sector. I think Kendra used the word right the way at the start that it's not a sexy sector. And we do need to sort of start showing a completely different side, and vitally get young people. And I don't know what it's like in the US. I would imagine it's probably quite similar. despite the fact that Claire and I are on this this event, women are certainly not reflected within our sector. Only 1% of HV drivers are female. And I think it's only around about 25% in total. So we've got to do so much more to diversify the sector. But yes, labour shortages are the thing that keeps me up all night.
Thank you so much. What a great point to end on. Blair has posted in the chat window how to register for the next one. I'm thrilled that out of the people that answered today, 28 out of 28 learned something. That's great. And that you're interested in the next webinar. We hope you join us. I want to thank all of the panelists for just your responsiveness, your support, your great answers today. Thank you very, very much. And we hope you return to the next one.
Thank you, everybody.